Guys. Uh, Welcome to the talk. Today, I'm going to be talking about 12 things I wish I knew when I started working in making games and making UI games. So I've had to sort of push myself back to when I entered the sort of industry and sort of thought about the things that I didn't know that I wish I did when I first stepped into that room and realized, all that I knew was wrong and all of that. So what I hope to do today is equip you with a few little principles, a couple of tools that will help you when you're making UI in games, or even if you're not, maybe they're useful in life, who knows? So basically, yeah, principles and methods and theories, they're like tools. And so once they cease to be useful, you get rid of them, you modify them. But if they don't serve you anymore, you just throw them away. So a little bit about me to start with. So as I said, I work in games, obviously, I'm here, but it wasn't always that way. I studied art, interactive art, using sensors and things to trigger movement in sculptures and whatnot, and I worked in video and did some promotion for films, making websites, mini games for movies. A few of them were successful, surprisingly. Things like Despicable Me, Ratatouille and Transformers I was lucky enough to work on. And then I went into sort of software dev for a bit, doing email software, which was dry as anything after working in films, but it gave me a grounding in like Perforce and sort of versioning control. And then I was lucky enough to get a job working in games and worked on CSR Racing, which was a success, luckily. So yeah, I'm just sort of lucky to have surfed that and then worked making other racing games with Electric Square. And most recently, I'm making VR games at nDreams. So I've picked up a few things along the way, I hope. So I've broken some of these into just 12 sort of anecdotal ideas. This is not like the 10 Commandments. They're just like quite silly titles, but I hope it slightly gives them a little bit more flavor and helps you remember them a little bit more. So first of all, yeah, be humble. I should sort of like crouch to you guys because you as individuals, you know things that I don't know, like massively, right? Everyone is an expert in them. And so when it comes to usability, that's really, really important to remember that, right? You're just one person. When you come to look at your UI, you see it through your eyes, but you have to try and use your empathy massively. It's like a gift, if you can, to see it through other people's eyes. But I'm mentioning this for another reason. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias where we all think when we're new to something that we know more about it than we do. And then when we're somewhat of an expert, we actually think that we know less than we do. So this is the only graph in the presentation, and it's pretty pointless, but you can see when you're new, you're down here and your actual proficiency. And when you're an expert, you actually underestimate how much you know a little bit. So this definitely was a case when I started in UI. I thought I knew loads about Photoshop, for example. I was used to being the person in the room who knew the most about Photoshop. And then you walk into a room full of people who know more than you about Photoshop and like 10 other coding languages that you've never heard of. Okay, so this is a little diagram. You may have seen stuff like this before. Just a reminder, when we're on our way to learning something, say this is the goal, the arrow at the top is where we want to be. We want to achieve a game. We want to get there. We want to make a UI. It's pretty intimidating. We're like, how do I get there? There's no ladder. And something that's worth remembering is there's lots of things that you know already, but if you order them correctly, there can be useful tools to get you there. So these are some of the skills and knowledge, hopefully little ideas that can help get you to the UI you want. And don't forget that you've climbed a huge mountain to get where you are. You're here, you're at Develop. You wouldn't be here if you weren't already quite an expert in many things like opening doors and stuff like that. So that stuff can be useful, right? That's an interaction. You can put that into your game. That's a real world interaction. So these little jumbled bricks, they represent knowledge that is yet to be ordered into something useful, but you've already got it. You already know it. So we know more than we think. So the best way to get to your destination is just to learn everything that you need to know, but no more. Just learn the directest route. So when I started off doing websites, I was totally lost in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, overwhelmed by all of that. I try and avoid code these days. But at the time, a wiser, cleverer person said to me, just learn what you need to know to get to the next step. Don't try and learn everything all at once. Some of the best advice I've ever had, I think. Unfortunately, when the goalposts move a little bit, it does come tumbling down. So it's like those platformers where you walk across the platform and it comes tumbling down after you've walked across them. Your knowledge might not be grounded enough to give you any sort of give when you move the target. But as I've said before, it forms a sort of basis and you can build it up. And this was really just an excuse so I could animate this guy. Because I'm an artist and if somebody gives me a presentation, I want to make an animation. So yay, he's really happy. He's at the top, yeah? He's really happy, happy feet. He or she or it is at the top. And you might just be happy to be there and achieve that skill level, and you could carry on doing that, right? You could carry on doing the same thing, making the same sort of game. And this might have been the case back 400 years ago with blacksmiths and whatnot. They could have carried on being a blacksmith. But I think even then, they would have wanted to specialize and become an armor smith or an arrow smith or whatever. So here's the guy who's learned the thing and he's just going to do that for the rest of his career. Cool. We can't do that. We have to keep moving. Technology is always moving. And so again, you're always doing this. This is how you're always going to be at the bottom. And if you think you've mastered your thing, then great, but there's always more, right? So always, stay hungry. I know it's a cliche, but just keep learning. If you think you've mastered it, then I'm afraid you're not looking ahead far enough. This leads into this green dot. This green dot represents what you know, what you can do. It's like your sphere of competence. And then you may be able to make toast. Let's say you're not a very good cook. You may be able to make toast. The green circle represents making toast, but the red circle represents beans on toast. Now, so the idea of heating up the beans, opening the can, it's just beyond you. You don't know how to do that. But with a little bit of help, you think you might be able to open the can. And so with a little bit of help, that zone is called the zone of proximal development. It's a thing in teaching, but it's really useful for games. It's basically like the Fatui or the tutorial. You teach people with just enough novelty that you're pushing them out of their sphere of competence. If they're in that sort of bit that they know, it can become boring. If you just drop them into chaos, then it's overwhelming. So you give them a little helping hand, and then before they know it, they can make beans on toast and they feel great. That's a huge positive release for everyone, and they can see themselves growing. What you don't want to tell them is that actually they've got so much more to know, right? Nobody really wants to know that, but that is the truth, right? We're never going to know everything, and there's actually loads of stuff that's unknowable. The good news is there's loads of random facts that you know across the whole sphere of knowledge. Little things like, the name of a boat that set sail in like 1588 or something, right? It seems totally random. You might know the name of a cloud in Latin. It's totally random. Then one day, you may find that it links up, and knowing that little bit of Latin just gives you that epiphany, like, oh, okay, like the cloud. So these like nice little gems of knowledge link up, and it's important to know that, because I don't think there's any such thing as sort of irrelevant information. I mean, it's good to be focused, but also have loads of random interests and loads of random knowledge, because it will one day all link up, and it'll give you a more holistic view. Socrates, because you've got to quote the Greeks, said this is him just about to drink poison because he was corrupting the youth, and he decided he would prefer to just drink poison. So Plato wrote that he'd actually said that, yeah, he is wise because he knows that he knows nothing. The oracle had said he's the wisest, Socrates is the wisest Athenian, and he'd gone, well, I don't know anything. Actually, nobody knows anything, but I'm the wisest because I know that I know nothing. So just remember that. And that is number one. Not the rest. The rest of them aren't that long, but that is number one. So be humble. Be like Socrates if you can. Number two, it's been said a lot in UI stuff. Don't reinvent the wheel. It's called the principle of least astonishment, or POLAR, or something. You like that? POLAR? It's called many things, but you all know this probably if you've done UI, UX. You don't want to do anything that's too surprising to your user. They press a button. If it takes them where they want to go or where they expect to go, then great. If you press a button and you end up somewhere you didn't expect to go, then that's a sort of nasty surprise. And suddenly you have to reassess your mental model of how the thing works. And nobody likes to feel stupid. So a famous American, he wasn't actually called Mark Twain at all. He's called Samuel, but that was his pen name. So he said that there was no such thing as original ideas. We just put them in a kaleidoscope and turn the kaleidoscope around. It's a hard thing for artists to hear, but because we've sort of put originality up on a pedestal and gone, yeah, it's original, therefore it's good. This guy, Steve Jobs. I can go back to that if anybody wants to check out. So obviously Picasso said that, Steve Jobs quoted him. Steve Jobs stole stuff. Picasso probably stole that quote as well. This ties in, don't reinvent the wheel. It ties in with a law of UX called Jacob's Law. It's named after Jakob Nielsen, who's a UX sort of heavy hitter. He runs a company called Nielsen and Norman, with Dom Norman, who's another really heavy hitter in the UX community. He's sort of the Norman Door is named after him. If you read his book, The Design of Everyday Things, it's really nice. He's a really lovely guy. So Jacob's Law, back to Jacob's Law, it basically says that you're going to be using other people's websites more than the one you're designing. So for games, I would say that people are going to be using other games more than your game. So you better make your game act a bit like theirs. Otherwise, you're going to surprise people. So these are the top, very small, top websites in the world as of a couple of months ago. Google. Google got to where it is at number one by not breaking conventions, by sort of following a lot of user conventions. It's so big now, it can create those user conventions. But you best just piggyback upon sort of design best practice that most people already use. So copy Facebook, why not? Not entirely, because that would be Facebook. I'd extend Jacob's Law to being most people use the world already. So what I mean by this is we know how doors work, right? So if you can build that interaction into your game, you're not going to surprise anyone. You can piggyback upon existing interactions that people already know how to use. So how much novelty is too much novelty? How much sort of familiarity is too much? If it's 100% traditional, if something's 100% normal and boring, it's just that, it's boring, it's gray, doesn't surprise you at all. This little cheese graph is meant to represent the 80% traditional and the 20% original. It could be even less than that, like 10% original. You need a little bit of originality, otherwise it's stagnant. And the traditionality grounds it and gives people a format in which they can understand it. If you produced like a piece of music that was 100% original, people wouldn't understand it as a piece of music. They would just hear it as noise until maybe 100 years after you're dead. And then they'd go, well, he was a genius. But you're dead. So don't do that. So don't reinvent the wheel. Number 3, make a map. So this means a couple of things. As a UI UXer, you're going to want to make wireframes and screen flows, all of that. And that's to explain to your team, people around you, how you're going to make this game. It's like a map. You can agree on the destination. You can agree on the sort of place names, as it were, what we're going to call this screen, what we're going to call this icon. That really helps talking about things. But the make a map also works for your user. So I don't know whether these are actually connected. Maps, yeah, okay. Maps help explain things to your user. So obviously, it's nice to know where you are within a UI, within a whole sort of interface. You want to kind of know, can I get home? How far am I from the end? Having certain elements that give you a bit of orientation. I think it's always important to have a home screen or a sort of safety net, back button. And home screens always function as a really nice orientation point where people feel sort of, I know where I am from here. There's a lot of UIs that get very sprawling, very complicated. People find it very hard to make a mental model of it. And, it's sort of overwhelming. People don't really like being overwhelmed. This is a famous map. It's been copied by most of the other tube maps of the world. This is more of a geographical representation of that map. So this is really an abstraction. We just accept it. It's really useful. It's more memorable. This is the sort of sprawling retinal type pathways that it really is. And this isn't much use to anyone, and no one uses that. It ties in slightly with Conway's law, which is just a sort of law of software dev more than games, where it says that your final product will sort of mirror the systems within your organization. So if your internal structure doesn't communicate with each other very well, then your game is not going to hang together very well. This is like catastrophic failures in shuttle launches because one team was using inches and one team was using centimeters. I'm paraphrasing, but look it up. Yeah, it causes disaster. So you need to make a map, agree what you're going to call things, and stick to it. Okay, this one's go with the flow. Yeah, I'd love to have a little Lilo right now, like that chap. I'll have some water instead. Yeah, so the flow state, right? It's been talked about a lot. It was very in fashion about sort of 8 years ago, the flow state in games. Once you get involved in a task, and you focus your attention fully on a task, time evaporates and you sort of lose your sense of ego. And this is a really enjoyable thing. It happens when you're gardening or doing that thing. You're in the moment, you're sparring, whatever it is. You can't actually be in mortal danger, so fighting wouldn't count, but it does certainly take your attention, but not in a nice way. So the flow state is what is like evoked in games. People seek it out. But like I said, you're actively involved. You have to be actively focused on it. So I've come up with this idea of a float state because I believe that when you're listening to music, you're not actively engaged, but your mind does wander. You're sort of cognitively immersed in a thing. You're not sort of actively engaged, and so it doesn't actually count as flow state strictly. We all have nice moments where we're in the bath or in the shower, have good thoughts. And so I wanted to kind of make this idea of a float state. And I think in UI, it's probably closer to a float state. It's more of a restful state of mind, a sort of browsing. You're not so actively engaged all the time. I think this can be a nice sort of solution to the more minute-to-minute flow state of a game. So it helps people sort of rest in between game loops, game sessions. Just an idea. I mean, I'll leave you guys to write the paper on it. I'm just going to put it out there. Function over form. It's been said a million times. It's no news to any of you guys here, but obviously it was something I wish I'd studied a bit more before starting UI. So quite often you have games that are, maybe they're run by the UX designer, and the UX designer is like, no drop shadows. It's all going to be just square rectangles. Or you might have a game that's run by the art director, and they're going, yeah, let's use a Gothic font. And right, it's somewhere in between you've got to go for. You can't use a font that's going to be illegible. You have to I tend to always go for function first and then make it look pretty afterwards, but never at the sort of victim of being functional. So the message is the king, right? We need to tell them what this page does. We need to get them to make a decision and get them through it in the easiest possible way. And the art should never get in the way. So form over function. If I was going to get a tattoo, it wouldn't be that either. Less is more. So, okay, very, very simple in terms of this is a sort of minimalist manifesto. Again, abstract, like we did with the tube map. People can only focus on a certain number of things. So give them less, they're going to understand. They're going to have more time to understand it. It's sort of to do with value as well. When a kid has like one toy car, that's their favorite toy. When they have 5 toy cars, that sort of value is divided amongst 5. They're somehow less valuable. So in that way, don't overwhelm people really with the UI if you want them to be able to use it. I think it is used sometimes intentionally to slightly overwhelm people. We see it in sort of retail, put loads of things in front of people and it sort of overloads them and they're forced to make a decision. So yeah, there was this idea in the 20th century of like, people love choice. Let's give them more than one washing up liquid. That's great. But but I'd say anything more than about 5 choices is too many. People get a bit anxious after about 3, really. So they don't actually need 50 different washing up liquids, but I think in retail it's used to sort of overwhelm people. They get to the top of their buffer, the cognitive load sort of overruns, and they're just like, oh, that one I saw in an advert. So that way, that's how advertising works. You just go back to sort of muscle memory. Oh, I saw that one on TV, it must be safe. Okay. So it's part of the dark patterns. But yeah, keep it simple. But that's like always been said, right? Since the 50s, when they were designing jets. You want to keep it simple. You want to keep it as minimal as possible. Only add complexity where necessary. So another paper written in the 50s by this guy called George Miller. He said, you can remember up to about 7 things, plus or minus 2. This isn't quite true for what we're doing, because in his test, he was getting people to actively try and remember things. Okay, actively, like, here's 7 things, remember them, I'm going to test you in 5 minutes. In the UI, we don't want to make people think. You know, in the words of Steve Krug, you've probably read the book, or like me, you've just read the title of the book. It's all you need to know. Yeah, don't make me think. So I'd say, yeah, no more than about 3 things to hold in your short-term memory. If you've got more, then you break it into manageable chunks. Like if I'm telling you my phone number, I won't tell you it as the one long string. I'll break it into sort of 3 bits. Number 7. User method. Again, this is not going to be a massive surprise to anyone, but UI is not strictly artistic inspiration. You know, traditionally an artist might go for weeks with writer's block, sort of artistic block, and then suddenly they stub their toe. They've got that idea for that amazing piece. We can't rely on that. It needs to be more methodological. Method? Anyway, I'll forget about that word. You know what I mean. So, I mean, my rough idea here is the same as any other sort of art. You're going to gather information, you're going to research your audience, you might make personas. And I'd suggest, yeah, after wireframes and clickable prototypes and all of that, you test it, you iterate. When you're experimenting with shape and color, do that all separately. Keep it as separate as possible so people can sort of critique it individually, and then it helps. So rather than sort of combining it all too early. And then obviously you get to the end and you rinse and repeat. There's a lot of iteration in UI. That's probably not a surprise to any of you guys. If you've worked in UI in games, you normally, if you've got time, you do it and you do it again, you test it and you do it again. Depends how data-driven your model is. They might want to test what that is, if that button's better as red or blue or green, and send it in front of a test audience. But I'm not exactly a massive fan of data-driven design because it sort of occludes your intuition. So all your sort of gathered knowledge from just people and graphic design, it sort of says, look, we're just going to use loads of data. I appreciate that it's hot, guys. I'm going to speed it up. So, like I was saying, data sort of says, look, use the data. Even if it looks awful, the data says, make it look like this. This may be familiar to some of you guys from Star Wars. For those of you who haven't seen it or need a reminder, Luke Skywalker, the hero, is trying to destroy an evil spaceship full of baddies. And all the other pilots are using this targeting computer. It's not really working out well for them. But it looks really exact. It's great. You know, it's got all the guides and the rulers and the grid, but they're just not nailing it. And Luke puts the targeting computer away and they're all like, Luke, are you okay? And he has a voice in his head that goes, use the Force, Luke. And he's not actually going mad. He's he's using his like inner voice, right? His intuition. He might be going mad, but anyway, it works out. And he manages to destroy the evil spaceship. Yay. The reason why I bring this up and I talk about UI is because we have all these tools, these wonderful rulers, alignment tools, grids, and they're awesome. They're really, really useful. But they're computer accurate. They're accurate to numbers and pixels. We don't really see the world that way. This is a little excerpt from a abstract on Netflix. talking about typography. These two letters appear the same height until you actually overlay them, and you realize that the C is actually taller. So our perception is full of little things like this. And I've got a couple of these clips. The S is not symmetrical. The middle bar is actually wider than the top bars. If you ever come to draw an S and you keep it the same width all the way through, it looks awful, and you can't figure out why. You're like, I'm using the guides. It's all the same width. It should look right. Our brain doesn't perceive it right at that point. The T is quite interesting, because although they look the same width, the descender, or whatever it's called, the stem, is actually not the same width as the crossbar. So yeah, do watch that if you get a chance. It's still on Netflix. So this is alignment by area. This little man, this little character, is aligned by area, just using Photoshop's alignment tool. And these ones are aligned by perception. I just sort of guessed at it. Aligned them by their head, really. But that's kind of how you'd want them, right? I'd feel this one's more correct and this one looks wrong. So there's a lot of occasions where you're better off just using your perception. We are designing for people, after all, not computers. So the one aligned by Photoshop is factually correct, but doesn't really help us. So counterpoint that with use science. There's been a lot of research by psychologists and AI people looking into computer vision and things like that. And we can look at that research and sort of read the top line. Gutenberg diagram, I don't think it's strictly science. It's something figured out in the age of print. It's this idea that your eye moves down the page. At least in countries where we read left to right, your eye sort of cascades down the page. The eye movement's called a saccade. There you go, there's some random knowledge for you. So it's quite good. You can write a title at the top. Any line you put halfway will actually catch the eye, and it will roll along it a bit like a marble rally. Dunk, deek. Point and line and planes and things like that will catch the eye. And then it leaves this nice space down the bottom for your sort of primary action or your call to action. You see it a lot in movie posters, and I guess that's where my grounding comes from in a lot of my work. When people are actually looking for information on a page, their eyes will move slightly differently. They scan and they run down the left-hand margin and do these quick darting things. But yeah, our eyes don't really move. When we're reading a word, our eye will actually sort of jump to the end and then back and then go in the middle. We think we read like this, but we don't. We're not computers. So I'm just going to rattle through these, but yeah, worth familiarizing yourself with behavioral psychology. Lots of mean experiments on animals where they train them to tap levers when certain light shows. B.F. Skinner and Pavlov, obviously conditioning and reinforcement, just worth knowing about, even if it's just to avoid the sort of evil gambling type games. But sorry, guys who work in gambling games. They use a lot of these techniques to promote addiction, but it's just worth knowing about. The Gestalt theories of perception, familiarize yourself with them. That's just how we sort of knit together this idea that the world is one thing. Really, it's just lots of little snippets of information, and our brain fills in the blanks. And Gestalt theories were like these Austrian theorists that worked out, if you have two things next to each other, you associate them more than if they're further apart. It sounds obvious, but it's not. If you squint, you may be able to see something in there. There's a prize for anyone who can see it. It's a cow or a dog. You get 2 lemons. Yeah, I think it's the scale I've made it, but it's meant to be a Dalmatian. It ties in a little bit with the squint test, which is just a really old school way of testing your UI. Just squinted it through your eyelashes, and if you can't see it, then you've probably not done a good enough job. Cognitive biases, again, just familiarize yourself with all of them. There's a huge list of them. Cognitive biases are just errors in our perception. We're all prone to them. We all sort of fall for these things, and most primates do, it turns out. So have a little look. A lot of them are used slightly coercively, like I said, in sort of retail games. So again, even if you just want to try and avoid them or see them in yourselves, the Dunning-Kruger effect that we mentioned earlier at the beginning, that's a cognitive bias. Anchoring, I'll move on from these science ones pretty soon, but anchoring is used in sort of menu design when you go into a restaurant and you go, all right, that one's £5, that one's £5, that one's £5, that one's £11. Oh, that one's too expensive. I'll go for the £5 one. They haven't used anchoring very well. If you go into a restaurant and you go, £11, £11, £11, £11, that one's £53. The £11 sounds really good value, right? So that by putting a piece of stimulus in there, it doesn't have to be the first thing they see. It's a form of priming, so it would help if it is the first thing they see. It sets your bar, your sort of value standards for everything else you see after that. It's why in supermarkets, when you go in, there's vegetables and fruit and flowers. It primes you to have a positive experience, because biophilia, it's a kind of a cognitive bias. We like green stuff. We like fruit. Belt and braces. It's just basically like, if something's worth doing, do it twice. With UI, you have to really hammer the message home. You can't just write it in bold. You have to write it in bold and highlight it and make it green and make it flash with sparkles and jump up and down. It also applies to navigation. So I like the idea that people use a game in different ways. I remember I was using this sort of bottom bar navigation and somebody else went, oh no, I just tap on the top. But it both took you to the shop. You could click on the cache in the info bar at the top, take you to the shop. You could click on the shop in the bar at the bottom. Both of us just use the game in different ways. I used to hear in web, oh no, you only have one way to navigate and everything else is confusing and therefore wrong. I would say, no, make all roads lead to Rome. Yeah, make all roads lead to your shop. I mean, I don't mean it literally. Don't make every button go to your shop. You're not going to see a great improvement in your conversion rates. With buttons, Apple, Google, they all recommend you use text and icon, right? You're operating on both levels, linguistic and iconographic, two parts of the brain. And eventually, you know that the white spanner means upgrade. You don't have to read it anymore. And as I said, even better than word and icon, use color. Even better than that, give it some affordance, make it look a bit more enticing. A drop shadow, I mean, it's an awful button, excuse that, but there you go. Number 11, games for everyone. So this is like a big heart, yeah? Games are for everyone. I mean, if they're not, then why are we doing them? There's so many games that are just for a certain type of like neurological, inclined person. Now, I'm dyslexic. I think that helps me because I can look at a game and go, I don't understand. I mean, games are mostly designed by people who are very literate and very good with numbers. And we have to remember, not everyone's like that. Not everybody's got two hands. Not everybody can read. And if you make your funnel massively wide as you can, you're going to get a lot of love from your audience. You're going to get a wider audience. So it's not only the right thing to do, it makes good business sense. It was really just to say that, designed for colorblind, designed for people who have only one hand, or people who have no hands, or people who can't see. I heard a question earlier about a gentleman inquiring about VR experiences for the blind people. And, that's a hard one. And it's got to be possible. With audio. So yeah, accessibility is like massively close to my heart, and I know it's a lot of money can be spent on it, and it can be seen as a sort of black hole where you could pour money. But I think more and more we're going to be seeing that's like in the forefront of everyone's minds. You quite often see with accessibility features, people will use them, even if they're not colorblind, they'll just prefer to use that feature or whatever. And it just means there's more ways to play the game. It's great. Number 12. Don't panic, in the words of Douglas Adams. So we tend to put a lot of ourself in our designs. We believe in it, we love it, we put our belief behind it, and then when it gets invariably sort of trashed and chucked in the bin because it's due to the iteration, we can sometimes feel upset by this. Again, this is partly due to a cognitive bias called attribution bias, where we will fiercely defend our viewpoint even if it's the wrong thing, just because it's our brainchild and we love it dearly. So you have to kind of step back, go for a walk, do some exercise. Nature's good. Go and make a cup of tea if you can't go for a walk or work out. Just walk away from it. Deep breaths. Remember, it's just a game. It's their game, probably, unless you're doing your own thing, in which case, good for you. You could probably do the UI you want if you're doing your own game. But, we tend to hold on to our ideas a little bit harder than we should. And eventually you come back and you look back at what they said and you go, oh yeah, you know what, you've got a point. It's just a game. You're probably right. But we've all had those stressful days where it can weigh heavy on our mind and just stress us out. So be like water, flow around the obstacle. You can sort of forget that you're trying to get there, and you sort of get distracted by the obstacle and you end up banging your head against the obstacle instead of just flowing around it. So yeah, in the words of Bruce Lee as well, yeah, be like water. That's it, guys. I hope I've given you some insight and some little clues, things that might be useful going forward. It is just the tip of the iceberg, but I hope it was interesting to you guys. So I think they're going to do questions, but they just got to wait till the mic is, if anybody's got any questions, or you can talk to me after.
Hey. Hello?
Hi.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. That was great. How do you see the kind of shift from 2D to 3D through technologies like AR, VR affect the kind of paradigms that you've spoken about?
Oh, cool, yeah. Well, I think you can rely even more on real world type reactions. So we've all used, interaction in real life, like turning on a tap or pulling a lever. In VR, it's obviously closer to that. You can use actual sort of haptic and, you use the same motion. So it's closer to that. There's definitely right now, you're right, a lot of the UI you see in VR is 2D in a 3D environment. And when you make UI that's fully 3D, it's kind of more in the game space and it's less considered UI. But then you still need menus and you still need that sort of thing. There are rare games where they'll build it into a more experiential type way. And that's nice to gamify the UI like that. Space Pirate Trainer, you shoot the UI to interact with it, which is lovely because it teaches you how to use the gun as well as interacting with the UI. So no, I do like that sort of stuff, more experimental. I think when it comes down to just ease of use, you don't want to surprise people too much. So they might find it easier if it just works and looks a little bit like their phone iOS because they've used that a billion times. So again, just piggyback on, there's sometimes value in just piggybacking on convention. Don't reinvent the wheel. All good. All right. Have a lovely day.